The warmth of the sun filtered through the sheer curtains as I stepped into my grandmother Helen's living room, a space that once brimmed with life, now dulled by the shadows of her Alzheimer's. The familiar scent of lavender, her favorite, hung in the air, a vestige of her vibrant spirit. I approached her with a smile, one I hoped would bridge the gap between her present confusion and the memories we shared. Yet, I could see it in her eyes, the flicker of recognition that would soon fade into uncertainty. "Hello, Grandma," I said softly, settling into the worn armchair across from her. She looked at me, her face a mixture of joy and bewilderment, before launching into a story I had heard countless times before. It was about the summer she spent at the beach with her sisters, laughter echoing through the salty air. I listened patiently, nodding at the right moments, even as my heart sank at the repetitive nature of her words. Each recollection felt like a thread unraveling from the tapestry of her life, each repetition a reminder of the cruel grip the disease had on her. As she spoke, I noticed a glimmer of something that made my stomach twist, a stack of unopened bills lying conspicuously on the coffee table between us. Their presence felt ominous, an unspoken weight that I couldn't ignore. My eyes drifted from her animated expressions to the bills, their stark whiteness a jarring contrast against the warm tones of the room. A sense of unease washed over me. Were they overdue? Had she forgotten to pay them? My mind raced with questions, each one more concerning than the last. Helen's voice faded into the background as I tried to piece together what was happening. My grandmother had always been meticulous about her finances. She would sit for hours, organizing her bills, balancing her checkbook with a precision that left no room for error. Yet here they were, a pile of unopened envelopes that spoke volumes of neglect or, worse, manipulation. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. The room, once a sanctuary of memories, now felt like a cage. I watched Helen as she continued her story, oblivious to the world around her, to the silent alarm bells ringing in my mind. The laughter in her eyes was genuine, but there was a hollowness to it, a void that made my heart ache. This wasn't just a visit, it was a confrontation with the reality of her condition, fragile, fleeting, and painfully real. I tried to redirect my thoughts, to focus on the moment we shared, the love that had always been the foundation of our relationship. But as her story looped back to itself, I felt the familiar pang of helplessness. I wanted to protect her, to shield her from whatever darkness lurked beyond the walls of her home. My mind flashed to Ethan, my cousin, her favorite family member. He had always been the charmer, the one who could twist anyone around his finger with a smile. I couldn't help but wonder if his influence stretched into this unsettling situation. As I left her house, a chill settled in my bones. The unease that had begun as a whisper now echoed loudly in my mind. I thought of the unopened bills, of Ethan's frequent visits, of how easily he could manipulate the situation to his advantage. The drive home felt interminable, each mile a reminder of the urgency I felt to protect Helen. I knew I had to dig deeper, to uncover the truth behind the surface. The love I held for my grandmother fueled my determination. She deserved better than this confusion, this potential betrayal. I parked in front of my apartment, the weight of my thoughts heavy on my shoulders. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at the precipice of something much larger than I had anticipated. I resolved to investigate further, to uncover whatever deceit lay beneath the surface of our family ties. My grandmother had given me her love, her wisdom, and now it was my turn to fight for her, to ensure that her twilight years were filled with dignity and safety, not overshadowed by the greed of someone she trusted. As I settled into the worn armchair in my grandmother's living room, I couldn't shake the unease that had taken root in my stomach. The sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the floor, yet the warmth of the day felt distant. My eyes drifted toward Ethan, who had just arrived with his usual charm, his smile wide and disarming. He moved around the room, effortlessly engaging with everyone, his laughter echoing as he recounted some light-hearted anecdotes. But beneath that pleasant facade, I felt a gnawing suspicion gnawing at my gut. Ethan was a master at weaving stories that garnered sympathy. I had seen it countless times before, family gatherings where he would recount tales of his struggles, painting himself as the misunderstood underdog. Watching him interact, I couldn't help but notice how he manipulated the emotions of those around him, drawing them in with his charisma. It was as if he thrived on their sympathy, feeding off their concern and compassion. I had always admired his ability to connect with people, but now it felt like a dangerous game, a mask that concealed something far more sinister beneath. The way he approached Grandma Helen was particularly unsettling. He would lean in closer, speaking softly, his tone dripping with affection, yet I sensed an ulterior motive beneath his kindness. I wanted to shake the feeling, to believe that he was simply the caring cousin he pretended to be. But as I watched him, my instincts screamed that he was hiding something that could hurt the one person I loved most in the world. The thought of my grandmother being at risk tore at my heart like a blade. I had to dig deeper, I had to know the truth. Later that evening, I found myself sitting across from Grandma at the dining table, the remnants of her dinner still on her plate. The conversation drifted aimlessly as she struggled to grasp the thread of our discussion, her words often trailing off into the void of her mind. I felt a tightness in my chest as I broached the subject of her finances, my heart racing with each word. I needed to understand what was happening, but how could I explain it to her when she seemed so lost? Her eyes clouded with confusion, and I could see the flicker of fear in them. I wished I could shield her from the harsh reality that loomed over us, but the urgency of the situation pressed heavily on my shoulders. Fighting back the rising tide of frustration and sorrow, I pressed on gently, trying to gauge her awareness of her financial situation. As she stared blankly at me, I felt the weight of helplessness descend upon me like a shroud. I couldn't tell if she understood the implications of what I was asking. Each moment stretched like an eternity, filled with unspoken fears and unanswerable questions. My heart ached for her, for the memories that were slipping away, for the safety she no longer seemed to have. After leaving Grandma's house, the need for answers propelled me forward. I found myself walking aimlessly through the quiet streets, the cool night air doing little to alleviate the heat of my thoughts. I needed to know what Ethan was truly up to. It was time to take matters into my own hands. I devised a plan, a reckless yet necessary decision to follow him after his next visit. The very thought made my heart race, but I had to uncover the truth, even if it meant stepping into the shadows. The following day, I positioned myself at a discreet distance from Grandma's house, waiting with bated breath for Ethan to arrive. When he finally did, I trailed behind him, my pulse pounding in my ears. I watched as he laughed and embraced my grandmother, a calculated display of affection that churned my stomach. As he walked away, I followed, my determination unwavering. The streets blurred past me, but all I could focus on was the figure ahead, my cousin, whose charming smile masked a sinister intent. Ethan made his way to a nearby ATM, and I held my breath, the world around me fading into insignificance. My heart sank as he pulled out Helen's bank card, the very card I had seen lying untouched on the table during my visit. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I watched him withdraw cash, oblivious to the storm brewing in my chest. Betrayal hit me like a physical blow, the realization that he had been stealing from my grandmother, exploiting her vulnerability, ignited a fire within me. I stood frozen, grappling with the reality of what I had just witnessed. The lines between family loyalty and my responsibility to protect Helen blurred dangerously, and I knew that my life would never be the same again. The confrontation with Ethan loomed over me, a storm brewing in the recesses of my mind. I stepped into the dimly lit living room, my heart racing as I spotted Ethan lounging on the couch, his casual demeanor a stark contrast to the turmoil inside me. His confidence was disarming, and for a moment, I wondered if I could even get through to him. I had seen the way he manipulated family members, wrapping them around his finger with his charm. Now, as I stood before him, I felt the weight of my grandmother's trust resting heavily on my shoulders. Ethan looked up, his eyes glinting with an unnerving mix of arrogance and mockery. He leaned back, crossing his arms, as if to assert his dominance in the situation. I swallowed hard, fighting against the instinct to back down. I had to be strong, I had to make him understand that I knew what he was doing. I took a deep breath, grounding myself in the knowledge of his deceit. My thoughts raced back to the countless times I had witnessed his interactions with Helen, how he would charm her with sweet words, all while wearing a mask that hid his true intentions. The air was thick with tension as I began to lay out the facts. Each accusation felt like a weight pressing down on my chest, but I had to press on. I could see Ethan's expression shift from casual indifference to a flicker of irritation. He was used to being the favored one in the family, the one who could do no wrong in the eyes of the others. But I was no longer a passive observer, I was ready to expose the truth. I recounted the ATM visit, the evidence I had gathered, the withdrawals that had been made with Helen's card. Each word felt like a dagger aimed at the heart of his carefully constructed facade. I could see the anger rising in him, a storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. The realization that I was no longer intimidated by him seemed to incite a primal reaction. He began to deflect, insisting that he was only doing what was best for Helen, that I was the one being paranoid. The irony of his accusation stung. I was the one looking out for her, while he was the one draining her resources. As he continued to weave his web of lies, I felt a surge of determination. I refused to let him manipulate the narrative any longer. I focused on Helen, her fragile state, and how he was exploiting her condition for his gain. I pictured her face, the confusion in her eyes, and the moments of clarity that shone through the fog of Alzheimer's. I had to fight for her, even if it meant standing alone against my own flesh and blood. With each passing moment, the tension escalated, the atmosphere thick with unsaid words and buried truths. I could sense Ethan's facade beginning to crack. The unflappable confidence was slipping away, replaced by something darker. I knew then that I had struck a nerve. The realization that his actions were being scrutinized lit a fire within me, a clarity that sharpened my focus. I gathered my thoughts, my resolve strengthening. I was not just confronting Ethan, I was standing up for my grandmother, for the memories that were slipping away from her grasp. I envisioned Helen's smile, her laughter ringing through the house, and it fueled my determination. I would not let Ethan take that away from her. I had seen too much, endured too many moments of helplessness, and I was done being powerless. The moments stretched on, and I could feel the impending confrontation building to a climax. I was ready to fight for my grandmother's dignity, ready to confront the darkness that had seeped into our family. I could almost taste the victory, the sweet satisfaction of justice served, but I knew it wouldn't come without a cost. Ethan's eyes narrowed, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he weighed his options. In that charged silence, I realized that this was more than just a family dispute, it was a battle for honor, for truth, and for the love that bound us together, however fragile it had become. I took a step closer, the distance between us closing, ready to confront the man who had betrayed the very essence of family. I had come too far to back down now. I was prepared to fight for Helen, prepared to expose the truth, no matter the consequences. As I stood in the dimly lit courtroom, the air thick with tension, my heart raced in rhythm with the pounding of my thoughts. The wooden bench felt foreign beneath me, the weight of my purpose pressing down harder than the polished surface of the table in front. I had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, piecing together a narrative that would expose Ethan's deceit. My fingers trembled slightly as I adjusted the stack of documents before me, a tangible representation of my resolve to protect my grandmother. The judge sat elevated at the front, a figure of authority whose gaze swept across the room with an air of impartiality. The courtroom was a battleground, with family members divided like pieces on a chessboard. I could see the familiar faces of my relatives, some casting glances of support while others wore masks of disbelief, torn between loyalty to Ethan and the undeniable truth of his actions. They had once viewed him as the golden child, the charmer who could do no wrong, and now they were being forced to confront the reality of his betrayal. As I began to present the evidence, my voice echoed in the silence. Each detail I shared felt like a dagger cutting through the facade of family harmony. I spoke of the ATM withdrawals, the missing funds, and the way Ethan had manipulated my grandmother's trust. I could feel the eyes of the judge upon me, assessing my credibility, weighing the consequences of what I was revealing. My heart pounded in my chest, the stakes of this moment making it feel as if the very air had thickened with unspoken accusations. Ethan sat across from me, a picture of feigned innocence. The way he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, radiated a confidence that only fueled my determination. I could sense his need to control the narrative, to twist the truth to fit his victimhood. As I spoke, I watched his facade crack ever so slightly. The charm that once endeared him to everyone began to falter, replaced by a flicker of irritation as the weight of my evidence mounted against him. In the back of my mind, I felt the presence of my grandmother, Helen. She had always been my anchor, and the thought of her struggling with the confusion of her Alzheimer's while all of this unfolded weighed heavily on my heart. Would she understand the magnitude of what was happening? Would she feel betrayed by the very person she once adored? I stole a glance at her, her eyes fixed ahead, her expression distant yet somehow aware. In that moment, I vowed to myself that I would not let her down. As the hours passed, the courtroom became a theater of emotions. Ethan's attempts to manipulate the situation were becoming more desperate. He played the victim, recounting tales of his own struggles, as if they could overshadow his transgressions. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, a chorus of conflicting opinions as my relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I could sense the doubt creeping in, the way some began to question their loyalty to him. I had to hold on to that. Then came a moment that seemed to suspend time itself. Helen, who had been silent throughout the proceedings, suddenly stood. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if the weight of her decision pressed down on her frail body. I held my breath, my heart racing as I watched her. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but it carried a clarity that sliced through the tension like a knife. She expressed her love for me, her grandson, and her disappointment in Ethan, the words reverberating through the room and striking a chord in the hearts of all who were present. I felt a rush of emotions, relief, pride, and a bittersweet sadness. In that moment, I realized how deeply I had underestimated the power of her voice, even if it was shaky and uncertain. She was no longer just a victim of her illness, she was a woman reclaiming her agency, standing against the very betrayal that sought to undermine her dignity. I could hardly believe what I was witnessing. The room fell silent, the weight of her declaration hanging in the air like a fragile thread binding us all together in that moment of truth. Ethan's facade crumbled further, and I could see the panic in his eyes, a stark contrast to the charm he had wielded so effortlessly before. The judge observed it all with a keen eye, the skepticism in his expression growing more pronounced. I knew then that the tide was turning. The courtroom, once a place of division, was becoming a stage for justice, and I could feel the momentum shifting in our favor. As I took a moment to absorb the gravity of what had just transpired, I felt a flicker of hope ignite within me. It was the kind of hope that came from knowing that we were not alone in this battle. I glanced at Helen, whose gaze met mine with a flicker of recognition. In that fleeting moment, I understood that love and truth could be powerful agents of change, capable of dismantling even the most insidious betrayals. The courtroom felt like a heavy cloud, thick with tension as the verdict was about to be read. I could barely hear the murmurs of the gathered family and friends, my heart pounding in my chest like a war drum. I sat there, my palms clammy against the cool wood of the table, anticipating the moment when everything would either shatter or be rebuilt. Ethan sat across from me, his smug expression betraying an air of confidence that I found increasingly irritating. I had watched him manipulate everyone around him, weaving a web of lies that had ensnared not only my grandmother but our entire family. As the judge entered, silence fell like a blanket. I glanced at my grandmother, Helen, who sat beside me, her eyes distant yet filled with a flicker of recognition. She seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the armrest. I wanted to reach out and hold her hand, to comfort her as she faced this nightmare, but I knew that this moment was about justice, about taking a stand against the betrayal that had threatened to tear us apart. When the judge finally spoke, his voice resonated through the room, cutting through the tension with a clarity that felt almost surreal. The words echoed in my mind: Ethan is ordered to repay the stolen funds and undergo counseling. A mix of relief and sadness washed over me, a bittersweet tide that left me feeling hollow and heavy at the same time. I looked at Ethan, and for the first time, I saw his facade begin to crumble. The confidence that had once radiated from him faded, replaced by a look of disbelief. It was as if the ground had been pulled from beneath him, and he was left grasping at nothing. I couldn't help but feel a pang of satisfaction. Justice had been served, and yet, my heart ached for what had been lost. The family I had once known was fractured, and the bonds of trust that had held us together were now frayed and torn. I glanced at Helen again, her expression a mixture of confusion and relief. She didn't fully comprehend the implications of the ruling, but I hoped somewhere deep inside her, she felt a sense of vindication. I wanted to believe that she understood the battle I had fought for her sake, that she felt the love and determination that had fueled my every action. As the courtroom began to empty, I found myself lingering, grappling with the emotional aftermath of the day. I felt like I was standing on the edge of an abyss, looking down into a void of uncertainty. The faces of family members swirled around me, some sympathetic, others filled with judgment. I felt exposed, as though everyone could see the turmoil I was wrestling with inside. I had stood up for what was right, but at what cost? When I finally approached my grandmother, I wrapped my arms around her, drawing her close. The warmth of her embrace felt like a balm on my fractured soul. She smiled faintly, a fragile expression that held a glimmer of the old Helen, the woman who had always been my anchor. In that moment, I felt a surge of hope. Perhaps the love we shared could mend the rifts that had formed in our family. Perhaps, despite the chaos, we could find a way to rebuild what had been broken. The weight of the judgment still hung in the air, a reminder of the battle we had fought together. I held her tightly, whispering silent promises of protection and care. I would shield her from the darkness that had crept into our lives, and I would ensure that she felt safe and loved in her twilight years. As I looked into her eyes, I saw a flicker of recognition, a moment of clarity that seemed to pierce through the fog of her condition. Our bond deepened in that embrace, transcending the pain and betrayal that had threatened to consume us. In the aftermath, as I stepped outside the courthouse, I realized that while justice had been served, the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges. The family dynamics would never be the same, and I would have to navigate this new reality with care. But as long as I had my grandmother by my side, I knew I could face whatever came next. The road ahead was uncertain, but I held on to the belief that love could light the way through even the darkest of times. As I sat at my desk, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room, a sudden ping from my phone jolted me from my thoughts. An anonymous tip. The message was vague yet chilling, hinting at a deeper betrayal than I could have ever anticipated. My heart raced as I read the words, each one pulling me deeper into a web of deceit. Ethan had not only been stealing from my grandmother but had also been plotting to use her assets for his own ventures long before the theft came to light. The numbness that had enveloped me since the trial began turned into a seething anger. I felt the weight of this new revelation pressing down on me, igniting a fire within. I knew I had to confront Ethan again. This time, I would not only expose his theft but also his treachery. The thought of my grandmother's name being tarnished, her trust so blatantly violated, fueled my resolve. I began to prepare myself for our encounter, gathering all the evidence I could muster, the emails, the bank statements, and the damning messages that the tip had hinted at. I rehearsed what I would say, the confrontation echoing in my mind as I paced the room, the walls closing in around me. The day of the confrontation arrived, a suffocating heat rolling in as I made my way to Ethan's apartment. Each step felt heavier than the last, my heart pounding in my chest as I imagined the scene that awaited me. When I finally stood at his door, I hesitated for a moment, steeling myself for what was to come. With a deep breath, I knocked, the sound resonating in the quiet hallway. When he opened the door, his usual charming facade was absent. Instead, there was a flicker of unease in his eyes, a recognition that something was amiss. I stepped inside, my mind racing as I laid out the evidence before him, the papers spread across his coffee table like a deck of cards waiting to be played. He paled as the reality of his situation sank in, and I felt a twisted satisfaction at the sight of his discomfort. As I spoke, my voice steady and unwavering, I saw the defiance in Ethan's eyes begin to crumble. He tried to defend himself, twisting the narrative in his favor, but I could see through his flimsy excuses. It was as if the air in the room had thickened, each accusation hanging heavy between us. And then, in a moment of desperation, he broke. The mask slipped, and I watched as the man I once admired crumbled before me, his bravado giving way to guilt and fear. He admitted to everything, his voice barely above a whisper. The words spilled out, a desperate plea for forgiveness that felt as hollow as the promises he had made to my grandmother. I stood there, my heart a chaotic storm of conflicting emotions. I had sought justice, yet here was a broken man begging for mercy, a stark contrast to the villain I had painted in my mind. It was a moment suspended in time, the tension palpable, and I felt the weight of my decision hanging in the balance. Yet, as I listened to him, something shifted within me. The anger that had driven me began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of clarity. My grandmother's well-being had always been my priority, and here was an opportunity to make a choice beyond vengeance. I realized that pursuing further legal action would only prolong the pain, drawing my family deeper into this pit of betrayal. Taking a deep breath, I made my decision. I would cut ties completely, not only with Ethan but with this cycle of resentment that had taken root in my life. I chose to prioritize my grandmother's peace over my thirst for revenge. As I walked away from that encounter, I felt a sense of liberation wash over me. The family may be fractured, but I had secured a safe haven for Helen, ensuring her final years were filled with dignity and love. In that moment, I understood that true strength lies not in the desire for retribution, but in the power of love and protection. I had fought for my grandmother, and in doing so, I had found a new path, one that led away from anger and toward healing.